Okay. Hello, Jan. Just saw you pop up there. Great to see some of the familiar faces here as well, and lots of new ones. Okay, so jumping into 9 steps for managing an event postponement or cancellation. Good morning to all of you. Good evening if you're on the other side of the world. I guess today I've got one main aim, and that really is to help as many people as possible that might be going through this process. So my hope is that I can give you some tools to help not only take the stress out of the process of a potential postponement or cancellation, but obviously hopefully try and facilitate the best possible commercial outcomes. I think right now we're focused on coronavirus and what impact that may be having, but the reality is that in our industry, there's many different reasons why we might need to postpone or cancel an event, and almost always it has a significant commercial outcome. I think sadly, this is going to have a significant outcome on the events industry. I was literally just talking to someone on email yesterday who's in the conference business, talking about a particular conference that I was supposed to be speaking at, or am supposed to be speaking at. It's in Europe, and the person said, if this conference doesn't go ahead, we're potentially bankrupt. And I think that's the horrible reality that faces some of the people that operate on fairly small margins in the event industry across the board. So trying to manage this as best possible is obviously critical. So over the course of the next about hour, I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. I know many of you on the call, but there's some people that don't know me, so maybe just 4 or 5 minutes on my background. I'm going to share with you the 9 keys, give some insights into some future webinars that I'll be running that may be useful, and give the opportunity for some questions as well. So a little bit about me. I wear 4 different hats. I'm an international speaker, both in the mass participation and event space, but also in other motivational spaces. I'm an author. I'm an advisor to governments and events and brands, and I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called Mass Participation World. In 2015, I published Mass Participation Sports Events with the hope of sharing some of my knowledge and insights that might be able to help others in the industry. So a little bit of a how-to. I've been very fortunate to have worked with some amazing brands across the world during that period of time, and have been responsible for managing millions of dollars worth of partnership, both cash partnerships and value in kind. And clearly, the reason I put that here is that obviously there's many stakeholders involved in this, and our sponsors and government partners are key partners, stakeholders that we need to engage with when we go through this process. One of my highlights was being the road event supervisor at the Sydney Olympics, and Jan's on the call, and we worked together on that, and I was very fortunate to have that amazing opportunity. I've been also incredibly fortunate to be at the helm of events for over 1 million participants during the course of my career, and that includes, in that photograph, the Standard Chartered Singapore Marathon, which at its peak was 60,000 participants, gave me many great opportunities and taught me many lessons. I've been in the industry for 35 years. I organized my first event when I was 16, growing up on a farm in Zimbabwe, and I've experienced events across, I think, 3 different continents now. During that period of time, I've dealt with many cancellations and postponements for multiple different reasons. Top left hand, when Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, died, I had to cancel a cycling event. The one on the right hand is a photo from Kuala Lumpur when there was a massive political demonstration and we had to postpone the event. I've had many weather-induced cancellations and postponement. Probably most notable of that was in Sydney many years ago with the JP Morgan Corporate Challenge, where we had such extreme weather, we postponed from one night to the next, and the conditions were still so bad that we had to cancel the entire event. And then my Mass Participation World Conference had to be postponed by many months in Bangkok when the King of Thailand died. I ultimately ended up selling my business to Ironman in 2016, and I'm now the founder and CEO of an organization called Mass Participation World. Some of you might be aware of the conference, and many of you, or some of you on the call, have attended our most recent conference and some of our conferences in Singapore. So a growing network of conferences around the world, an insights platform, advising that I've touched on, and very passionate about education, of which obviously this is one of. So moving on to the 9 steps, and I think all of you that have registered would have seen this framework that I either sent out in an EDM, posted on LinkedIn or on Facebook or so on. So I'm not going to dwell on it because I'm going to go through each of them step by step. And really wanting to start with the first one is the importance of pausing and allocating time and resources. Often the temptation when you get faced with a situation of potential postponement or cancellation can be one of panic. Oh my goodness, you know, particularly if it's an event day one, you've got an impending storm coming through. And what I really would like to reinforce and reiterate is what I call the power of pause. And that is that in every situation, there is always more time than you think to take a step back, to consider the various aspects of what you're dealing with before you move forward. And as an example of the importance of not rushing your decision, letting the clock tick a little bit, albeit that it might be making your heart race a little bit faster, I wanted to share an example that's a real life example for me. In 2012, I got a call from the police. And as we all know, when the police call you, you generally sit up and take notice. In this case, it was the police in Kuala Lumpur to tell me that they had intelligence to indicate that there was going to be a political demonstration on the weekend of a huge cycling event that we had. I think we had at that stage 4,500, 5,000 participants signed up for a cycling event through the heart of Kuala Lumpur. It was about 4 weeks before the event, and the recommendation was that we should consider postponing the event. And obviously in that situation, many stakeholders involved, but when the police and government agencies as a key stakeholder make that recommendation, you know, it's generally my advice that you work with them to achieve that. So of course I said, yes, certainly we'll do that. We'll gather the team together. We'll put out a press release. The immediate response was, hold on, this is only intelligence. It's not in the public domain. We're giving you as early a heads up as we possibly can, but it's not something you can announce yet. So the immediate response was, oh my goodness, that's terrible. We're 4 weeks before this event. We've got Christmas in between. The event was to be in mid-January. And you're now asking me to hold on, and how long might it be until this makes the public domain? The reality was it took nearly a week for it to be broken in the newspapers. And whilst, as I say, the initial reaction was a little bit of, oh, panic, we need to make an announcement soon, people have made travel plans. The beauty of it was that it gave us all this time to engage with stakeholders and put in place a really robust plan that when we announced it, it really ran like clockwork. We postponed the event. It was hugely successful when we postponed it. We managed all the different elements of it. And the reaction, if I hadn't had that, hang on, you have to pause for a week, would have been to probably have responded within probably not much more than 24 hours. And I'm convinced that we might have got elements of it wrong. So using that to reinforce that I believe, and my experience is, that there is always more time than you think there is, and really important to take in that big, deep breath, implement the power of pause, make sure that you are very clear on what it is that you're doing before you press play and move forward. Also important to allocate the right resources. So take a step back and understand who it is, and I'm going to talk a lot more about different elements of this going forward in terms of stakeholder engagement and so on. But right here, I'm talking about internal resources. Which of your staff do you need in the room? Who do you need to be engaging with? And making sure that you pull people into the room internally, as opposed to, oh, I'm too busy, we've got another project, this person needs to do something, this person's on holiday, we can't call them back. Within reason, get the right people in the room as best the situation allows to make sure that you have the right resources to do the initial research, and then to be able to manage whatever decision it is that you decide to move forward with. The second step is clarifying the key issues and understanding who your stakeholders are. And I generally break these into 4 key areas, and some of you may have lots of other areas that make sense. Clearly, the safety of participants and all stakeholders is a number 1 priority, and sometimes that takes the decision out of your hand. If you are having to make a decision which compromises the safety of anyone that's involved, as may be the case now with the coronavirus outbreak, do you want to be the event that went ahead for a bunch of other reasons, financial, operational, reputational, that ultimately ended up with someone dying or being sick as a result of them contracting the coronavirus as part of your event? When there's an extreme weather warning, are you going to take the risk because you're worried of the financial implications that a cancellation might impact on you, with the risk that ultimately the financial impact may even be bigger? So the idea is gathering as much information and data as possible in the time that you believe is available. So again, going back to that power of pause, how long do we believe that we have to make this? We've allocated that we think we need to make a decision by tomorrow, or as we stand on the start line of an event and there's an impending lightning storm, you might have minutes or at maximum hours to be able to make that decision. But how much data can you gather? What is the financial implication? Do you have insurance in place? What are the parameters around that? Do you have a refund policy in place? And what are the financial implications that that is going to create on you and your event? What are the operational implications? Is there going to be another venue available? Are your suppliers available? Is your volunteer pool going to be available? And all the other elements that go around that. And then what is your reputational risk? And again, in the case of, the hour that we've got available, I could deep dive and probably spend an hour just talking to you about the 4 things that are on this page. But I guess what I'm wanting to do in the time that we have available is just give you some thought starters here. Go and make that list of what all the safety elements are. Go and make that list and understand what your financial implications are, whether you postpone, whether you cancel. Some of you might be sitting here right now saying, okay, we've got an event that we think we may have to cancel. What are your financial tipping points? When do you get to the stage where you're having to pay a venue balance of payment, when you're going to have to pay for branding to be made, or whatever those may be? So really understanding in your timeline of your cash flow, what are these tipping points that are going to have a major implication? So I was talking, I've been working, I do a bunch of mentoring, been working with a young guy, Ben Williams. Ben may even be on this call, based out of Australia. He runs some outdoor cinemas in Singapore. And one of the things we looked at is when are the tipping points of when he was going to incur substantial expenses which he may not be able to recoup if he decided to make the cancellation or postponement decision. So really understanding what those tipping points might be. And then I've touched on some of the operational and reputational ones, but getting that team together to gather as much reliable information and data. And at the moment, obviously relative to coronavirus, are you monitoring the media? Are you very clear on what the government rules and regulations might be in your particular jurisdiction? Because sometimes in these situations, these decisions, whatever we may decide as an organization, as a rights holder internally, and I know we have some government agencies on a call, the call is taken out of your control. It is made by a government agency. You may be putting on a triathlon. There may have been overnight rain, and you might want to go ahead, but the health authorities will say to, or the environment authorities will say, the water quality is such that you may not go ahead, your event is cancelled. And then identifying who all your stakeholders are in this process. So clearly there's probably sponsors, there might be participants and athletes, there may be suppliers, government agencies that we've spoken about, venues and so on, but being very clear and having a very detailed list of not only who they are in terms of what buckets they fall into, but who are your key contacts that you're going to be communicating with as you make this process. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that communication process, how that engagement might be done. But as you do this internal information gathering, really important to be clear on who it is that your stakeholders are. From a step 3 perspective, then this very detailed evaluation and making a provisional decision. So you've gathered all the data, but clearly there is going to be a change of plans. And before you go to your stakeholders, so I'm saying that this is a pre-stakeholder discussion, it's important to come to a decision internally to say, this is option 1, this is option 2, this is option 3. And our recommendation to our stakeholders is option 1. But we're going to have with them to be, when we go and discuss with our stakeholders, we're going to be in a position to say, but if this scenario unfolds, maybe it's option 2. And if this scenario unfolds, it might be option 3. But being very clear that with the data that you've been able to gather in the time, and sometimes, so let me take, for example, a situation of a impending lightning threat to an event, and you need to make a decision in a very short period of time. I would hope that as an organized event, you already have a contingency in place, that you're very clear on what happens when that plan gets put into place. And if you're in that situation, you kind of take that out of the event manual, and you're very clear to say, well, these are the decisions we made in our tabletops. These are the decisions that we made with the stakeholders, and to then be able to, whether it's getting a crisis committee together or whether it's getting on the phone or the radio to say, you remember, we agreed that crisis plan A, contingency plan A, we are now invoking that, and that's where we're moving forward. We have a change of plans. The event is not going to flag off at 6 a.m. We believe we have an ability to be able to postpone it. The storm is going to pass and it's going to happen. And we hope that we're going to be able to start it at 6 a.m. or whatever that may be. But being very clear that in some instances, it might be a completely left field that you haven't had a contingency plan for it. But being now very clear from an internal perspective, after you've spent 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 5 hours, 3 or 4 days, or in the case of a KL event, a week, that you've been able to be very clear on what your plan is. And obviously, in the case of that week that we had, after a few hours, fundamentally about a day, I was able to go with a very clear contingency plan, initial plan to my stakeholders, and then engage them in the plan. Step 4 is then moving on to that engagement of your key stakeholders. And one of the key questions I ask here always is, who needs to be at the table? Sometimes the temptation is to get everyone in the room, everyone into a conference call or a video call to have a conversation about where things are heading. And the reality is that if you spread that net too wide in the initial phase, it may end up compromising your ultimate decision. And again, I'm going to take you back to the Cycle Malaysia situation and share with you a little bit of what we did in that situation. So, as I shared, we were acting on intelligence that had been brought to us by the police. It was confidential at that situation. We built a partnership and a trust with them that they felt comfortable coming and sharing that information with us. It was in our interest to ensure that we engaged with our key stakeholders, but that we were able to maintain the integrity of that confidential information and minimize the risk of it being shared to parties that it maybe shouldn't be shared with. So again, making sure that it didn't get leaked to the newspapers, it didn't get posted on social media that would look like it might have been us that had compromised the trust of the police. So we then sat down with only a small group of people that we brought to the table, into the tent is an expression that I sometimes use. And those were the key government agencies that we were already involved with. Obviously, our title sponsor, OCBC Bank, in that situation. We needed to engage with the venue to understand what alternate dates might be available. And we worked with that core group over the next couple of days to decide what our strategy was, to identify a postponement date where the venue was available, to be able to set in place a refund strategy. People had booked flights and hotels and accommodation, so we needed to be very clear on what that strategy was. We were very clear on what our financial implications were, what additional costs we were going to be incurring, what deposits we might be able to hold back. Some of the other stakeholders that we needed to engage with were obviously the participants that were going to be impacted. There were a number of our support partners and sponsors, and there were a couple of those for strategic reasons that we brought into the tent, and there were a couple of them we left out of the tent. There were suppliers that we needed to engage with to ensure that they were going to be able to provide the services that we needed. There was a whole events calendar that we needed to go and interrogate to see what other events might be on that we might be clashing with, which we gathered that information in the lead up to the event in our internal discussions. But there were a couple of stakeholders we needed to discreetly engage with to see what the plans around their event were that might be impacting our event. Remember, we were closing a significant amount of roads in the heart of a city, and another event in a different part of town even had the potential to impact that. So there was a need to engage discreetly with those people. So by the time we had got to the stage of being ready to announce and it hitting the public domain, we had a clear plan in place. We'd engaged with a core group of stakeholders that we'd brought to the table. And then the day before we made the announcement, we then brought everyone else into the tent. And sometimes in that situation, that can create anger and frustration. Why have you only come to me one day before the event or a few hours before making the announcement? People feel a little bit disempowered. And obviously you need to be prepared for that discussion. But we were then able to go to the second tier for what we called them stakeholders, within no reason meaning disrespect, to go to them and say, this is what's happened, this is the decision we're making, we're giving you the information before it becomes available in the public domain, and then you basically bring everyone into the tent to be able to have gone through that process, and you haven't cluttered the process by bringing a whole bunch of people to the table who may be muddying the waters, who may be bringing other issues to the table that are not really key. And going back to a little bit earlier on when I spoke about the key issues, one of the points that I meant to make is being very clear on what your most important issues are when you're working out initially what you're dealing with. You can often get muddied in your decision-making process with issues which are lesser issues, you know, whether the timing company might be available or whether the marquee company might be available. They're going to be key issues, but the most important issue you have is you have an impending lightning storm, you have a coronavirus that's going to come through, gathering the most information related to that. And again, that overlays into the stakeholders that you bring to the table. So hopefully that little bit of case study shows you in real life how we were able to apply that. And ultimately we had a fundamentally perfect postponement. We announced it, we got great buy-in and support from the participants. All of the stakeholders were on the same page. We postponed the event. We had the mayor riding in it, and it was a hugely successful event with most of the participants being able to take part. Step 5 is then the whole process of refining and agreeing the final decision. So you've gone to your stakeholders with a recommendation. You've taken on board all of their challenges. So in some instances, it might be that a particular sponsor, maybe even a key sponsor, maybe your title sponsor, has a major issue with the particular date that you are postponing. There may be an issue around the venue availability. So by the time you've picked all those up in the kind of going public, from step one being your internal recommendation to this whole process of engagement. So I think step three, is your internal engagement, but the engagement with your stakeholders, you're then in a position to say, you then marry all those up. Between you agree what that final decision is, and you basically tick that decision with a view that you're now able to move forward. And in some ways that might sound kind of relatively easy. You've had all these discussions, you've come to a consensus. What I've found on a number of occasions is that often you won't get that consensus, and as the rights holder, you have to have the courage, the conviction to sometimes be the leader in the room to say, well, I take that on board, I understand that, I'm sorry, but this is the decision that we're needing to go forward with. And that sometimes can take real strong leadership, real conviction to be able to say, I'm moving forward. By the same token, you need to be open-minded enough when you take that initial recommendation to the table with your key partners to be open to listening and hearing the issues that they have, as opposed to the initial process being, this is the decision we made, this is the way we're going forward. It very much needs to be consultative and partnership, but then being able to take that step back and say, I've now gathered my internal information, I've gathered the external information, this is the decision that I, as the leader of this project, or we as a team are making, and have the courage of your conviction, which sometimes may go in contradiction to some of your key stakeholders in the process. Step 6 is then the importance of having that detailed plan. And as I said earlier on, I'm hopeful that most of you would be in a position where you already have a fairly detailed contingency plan. You've gone through a risk management process, you have operational plans in place, you have crisis plans in place, and the easier step should be that it's a matter of taking an existing plan and refining it. So, you know, in the event of a lightning strike or a political demonstration or a leader dying or something, the hope is that you've got a plan in place where you have already identified what those contingencies are, what the stakeholders are, and you're able to spend time allocating resources to be able to work through that plan and address it. It may be sometimes, though, that it's a completely left field and you have to literally throw out what you've got already. You know, my gut is that there's probably very few people sitting on this call that had a plan for a coronavirus type of event, let alone a coronavirus, because clearly nobody had knowledge of coronavirus. You might have taken the SARS precedents and overlaid those to that. But my gut is that many of you that are on the call, maybe in the last weeks, have started to develop or refine an existing plan. But in many instances, you know, a couple of weeks ago, no one would have had a plan specifically related to this and the implications. There's probability that some of your postponement or cancellation scenarios, whether that be a political demonstration or whether it be the death of someone or whether it be weather or something, can be adaptable. But I think it takes us back, and I'll talk about a little bit more, that the importance of, in your planning process, really critical to always be assuming what will happen if I need to postpone this event 1 month out, 1 week out, 1 day out, 1 hour out. What are your strategies? What are your plans? And what resources, now that we've reached this stage in this process, as we get to step 6, I spoke earlier about putting those resources in place, being very clear now on having that new plan, whether it's the refined one or it's a brand new one, and bringing those resources to the table and really working on that plan before you make the announcement. Sometimes you need to make the announcement and in parallel work on that plan. But now, what are the operational plans that need to be addressed? You know, how are you working, for example, of recontacting your volunteers? Maybe there's some new training that needs to go in place around dealing with something like a coronavirus. How do you put that in place? Who do you partner with? What are the key elements of what needs to be involved there? What's your communication plan that needs to go with that? Have you got an existing one that's going to work, or do you need to plan it, stage it? What are the implications from the operational planning of suppliers that might not be available? What are the new suppliers that you might need to bring to the table to be able to implement that? So every different detailed element, and there's a number of different events sitting on this call, from outdoor cinema that I've touched with Ben. There's running events. There's one championship with mixed martial arts events. And for some of you that joined the call late, they've recently made a decision to cancel a Singapore event to the public, but to stage a closed door event, which is a media event only. So, there are many different options here that, with a bit of lateral thinking, can come up with a plan. Also, for some of you that may have joined late, may not be aware, the Tokyo Marathon made the decision last week that they would cancel the mass participation element of theirs, but continue with the elite element. So a small group of runners, close the city roads, but with the added challenge of encouraging spectators not to come out and watch the event, but still having this opportunity to have an elite race, which is obviously part of the World Marathon Majors, as part of a global circuit. There's sponsors that have the opportunity to get some of those broadcast benefits, albeit missing out on some of the engagement benefits. So there are ways that you might be able to have a radically different plan by thinking out of the box, but you've now got to, I guess, recreate the operational elements of it. So what does that now mean, for example, with Tokyo Marathon? What do they do to encourage the public not to come out? What's their communication around that? If the public does come out, what are the safety measures that they put in place? What are the safety measures that they're going to be putting into place for their volunteers, which many of still will be required for being course marshals and running the aid stations and so on? Same with one championship. I'm sure you've got a whole bunch of plans now that need to be refined for those volunteers, albeit a smaller number that you need. How do you ensure their safety in terms of coronavirus, and obviously the athletes and so on? What are the revised plans that need to be put in place? So being ready to ensure that you have all that in place. And the reality, as I said, is that you may not be in a position where you can actually have all those plans in place before you make your announcements, but you need to be very clear of what the elements of that plan that you need to put in place over the next hours or days or weeks before your event gets underway, if it gets underway, or in the event of a cancellation, what is it that you need to do? What are the operational plans that need to be put in place? It might be, for example, that you have T-shirts that the runners or triathletes or cyclists are going to get. You've got goodie bags that you decide that you might still, or you would still give out to people. What are the operational plans that need to be put into place? So by the time you make the announcement, you're very clear with the plan, as opposed to, okay, we've postponed the event, we've canceled the event. Oh my goodness, we're going to give out the goodie bags, and everybody's phoning in and getting on social media saying, where do we get our goodie bags? Where do we get our T-shirts? Can we have our medals? And you're now scrambling and spinning the wheels to put that plan in place. And again, I come back here to that very first point that I made about the power of pause. Sometimes the temptation is to rush to make that announcement. Sometimes there's huge pressure on because people, participants, stakeholders are getting on social media and putting pressure on you. I've made mistakes on occasion of going to social media before I was really ready, not quite getting my facts right, and it's backfired on me. So that power of pause, even when you've made your decision, sometimes it's worth buying an extra couple of hours, an extra day, an extra few days to make sure that you are very clear on that plan before you press play and make the announcement of the postponement or the cancellation, so that you are fully equipped to be able to deal with it. Once you get to that stage, one of the most crucial pieces of it is then the communication, the announcement. And friends can be won and lost at this situation. Reputation can be massively damaged if you haven't really been considered about this element of it. What are your speaking points? What are the key elements that you need to go through before you make this announcement? So one of the key things that I always consider is, can I manage this myself with my internal team, or do I need a specialist in my corner to be able to help me? Do I already have a PR agency that might be helping me with the marketing of the event, but are they really the appropriate agency to work with me in a time of crisis? There is a very big difference between being a PR agency that helps you get a whole bunch of column inches to be able to be promoting your event and attracting their participants, to someone who has the capabilities to help you in terms of crisis. And there's various elements of that, and I'm only going to be able to touch on a few of them in the time that we have available. But my recommendation, depending on the size of your event, the size of your organization, is it is always incredibly valuable to have a PR agency in your corner, whether that's sitting alongside you in the room when you make the announcement, if it's a public announcement in front of television and media, or is it an agency that is just helping you to craft the messages that you're getting and to be able to manage the inevitable feedback that you're going to get when you make one of these decisions, particularly if it's a cancellation that you're going for. So one of the key elements of that, even if you decide not to go with a PR agency, is the importance of deciding who your spokesperson is. I've seen instances where there are multiple people within an organization fielding inquiries. My recommendation is that it should always only be one person that is empowered within your organization to be the spokesperson. And that might be as simple as, when you put a media release out, Chris Robb, CEO of Mass Participation World, said this, blah, 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 blah. Or it might be that Chris Robb is the person that fronts the media if you end up being in a media situation. It might be that Chris Robb is the key person that is speaking to the media if they are phoning in to make a call. It's not the person on the front desk. It's not necessarily always the marketing manager. And really, really critical that that is communicated throughout the entire group, that no one has the authority to make a communication to the media, from members of your immediate team all the way down to volunteers. So one of the key messages that I've delivered hundreds of times in my 35 years in the industry when I do volunteer briefings is that none of you are to be put in the awkward position of having to respond to the media. And at the same time, none of you as a volunteer or contractor are authorized to make a comment on behalf of the organization. Please direct any inquiries to this particular person, and that might be their particular leader, who then can pass that on to the spokesperson. And again, depending on the size of your event and the likely outfall and the possibility that it's media and fronting the media, I would strongly recommend that if your spokesperson isn't experienced, you invest the money on giving them some media training. Sometimes that can take as much as a day, but as a minimum, if they're not experienced, sitting in a room for an hour or a couple of hours before they front the media, to give them the tools to be able to manage the questions that might come at them, create what we call in the industry a message house, to be very clear on what the key speaking lines are, what the key message that you want to come back to. And for those of you that haven't had that experience, someone who can give you that media training can give you the clues. If the media are being aggressive, there are different, it's called bridging. You can bring you back to the particular message that you want to portray. You go and you front them with a clear number of speaking points that you always try and come back to, so you don't end up trapping yourself in a situation or being trapped. It's not a matter of being uncooperative. It's actually very important to be seen to be cooperative, but to give yourself the tools and the confidence and ability to be able to, it's quite a daunting situation if it hasn't been done before, but to try and get yourself empowered and as skilled as possible in the short time sometimes available before you front the media. And being very clear when you are selecting that spokesperson, who is the best qualified in terms of the combination of all of those. The level of seniority, so you're respecting the decision, but maybe the level of skill. So it might be that your temptation might be to put the CEO in front of the media, but the CEO doesn't have the right presence. They don't respond well in media. They might be someone that gets flustered. They might be someone that becomes aggressive when they get put in a corner, and you might be better off putting your marketing director or maybe even your operations director who's able to speak to the operational elements of why the decision was made. So a whole bunch of discussion around that. Then it's really important to get the wording right when you make the announcement. So typically there will be a release of some sort that may be sent to the media. It may be shared with participants, and it may vary depending on the different audience that you're sending it to or announcing it to. But being very clear, and again, this is where a media agency can help you. If you're a small event and there are some small operations on this table and you don't feel you have the budget, go online. There's lots of templates there to help you in terms of creating a press release, a media release, or working with friends in the industry. You know, there might well be someone who's a bigger organization than you that would be happy to have a coffee with you, run your media release past a number of people before you put it out there, and align with your media release. Really important to ensure that you craft a number of Q&As. So what are the key questions that you might be asked, and how are you going to respond to those? A, if you're in front of the media, so that helps with your briefing to be able to go in front of the media, but also how does that work so that your messaging is consistent across all the platforms that you're addressing on. So you might have a call center. They have exactly the same answer to every single question that might be asked as the person that's managing your social media and responding to the questions that are coming up on Facebook or Twitter or any other particular platform that you might be being bombarded on, which is sometimes the case. And then looking at how you might refine that as you get feedback, but really important that you're consistent with what your announcement is, that ties in with the Q&A that you've prepared, and that everyone in the organization who has the responsibility for speaking, and that speaking might be in the social media space, it might be a call center, it might be the spokesman that I've spoken about, is reading from exactly the same song sheet at every stage. And then being very clear before you make the announcement of what are the mechanics and what are the platforms that you're using. So we decide today that we've made the decision that the event is going to be postponed, or it's, heaven forbid, going to be cancelled. We've made the decision that the announcement will be made at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. And sometimes with guidance from your media outlets, from your PR agency, there's particular times of the week where it's more convenient to be making these announcements depending what it is that you want to achieve. Sometimes if it's very controversial, the hope is that it doesn't necessarily get picked up by the media. So you might put it on a busy media day in the hope that it doesn't gain as much traction. If you're wanting to get it out to as many people as possible, then you're wanting to find it at a particular slow time of media so that you can get as much traction as possible. So within that strategy, agree on the time, agree on the mechanics. Is it simply emailing something out to all of your database, posting on social media? What platforms are you going to post on? What are the key platforms for your event? Is it your website? Is it Facebook? Is it Twitter? If it's a business event, maybe it's more of a LinkedIn or whatever those may be. Or is it such a big event that you need to call a press conference? Then that comes down to where is it going to be? What's the operational? Who are the people that we get in the room? We have to give enough lead time to be able to ensure that the media is going to be able to attend. No point sending it out now and having a media conference in an hour's time, and so on and so forth. So being able to make those key decisions before you make that announcement. Then step 8 is the all-important monitoring. And this is a grab from an event which was cancelled, TCS, Tata Consulting Services event in Clark, which was announced a couple of days ago that they were cancelling their event in the Philippines. I can't read all of the Tagalog, but just to give you an example, there's lots of chats going on here, people asking about getting their goodie bags and so on. Who's monitoring those channels? Who's monitoring your emails? And then to your speaking points that I've touched on, how are you tweaking those and adjusting them? So if you're getting the same question 10 times on your social media, do you update that? Do you put a post out to make sure that it's being addressed across all of your channels? So with clear and concise monitoring and response to that, you can save yourself a huge amount of time and effort. And again, being sure that there's not a particular thread which is creating negativity for you. What's important in your planning is to create a whole bunch of positive content in the lead out, not being disingenuous, but when you get a whole bunch of negative feedback on there, it's possible to start pushing that down the feed by putting positive out or responding to questions that are more positive, getting your advocates to be coming on and supporting you with that. And by monitoring that, you can then be getting your advocates to put positive and feeding your positive stories in at necessary and appropriate times. And then obviously monitoring all of your operational elements. How is your planning going? Are you on track? And are you ready to be able to implement whatever decision that you've been able to do? And step 9 is the one that so often gets overlooked. So I've cancelled an event, I've postponed an event. So for example, the Kuala Lumpur event that we had, hugely successful. The temptation often is to say, hey, great, well done, high fives, we managed to do it, let's move on and get on with day-to-day business. The really valuable time that you can spend, as with the post timing in any event, is to get in a room and say, what did we learn from that? Let's document them. Let's adapt our contingency plans to ensure that we're in a position that the next time this happens, because believe you me, it might not be a coronavirus, it might be something else. There are going to be many lessons here that you can apply to other parts of your event and indeed your business. So just a quick summary, 9 steps for managing an event postponement and cancellation. There's always enough time to pause and make sure that you allocate sufficient time and resources. Be conscious to clarify the key issues and importantly understand who your stakeholders are, and really importantly, what are your key issues and not your peripheral issues that are potentially muddying the water for you. Be very clear on making sure that you, within your time frame, have a very detailed internal evaluation before you make your provisional decision that you then take to your stakeholders and engage with those stakeholders and discuss and then understand what some of their issues might be. Together with all of those partners and stakeholders, refine and agree that final decision. Then be in a position where you, once you've made that decision, you create this very detailed plan across all of the different verticals of your particular event. And then at step 7, the communication and the announcement, all critical, and all the different elements that go with that in terms of your crafting and obviously making sure if you need to have a PR agency in the room. Really important not to then make the announcement and walk away from it and think that it's going to take care of itself, to monitor everything that's out there, and then really key to harness the lessons and review and see what you can learn from it going forward. I just wanted to quickly touch, as I said at the beginning and a number of times, I could probably spend an hour on almost every one of these pages. There's lots of detail behind it. And so I'm offering, if anybody's interested, the opportunity for a deeper dive. One of those options would be a much more detailed 2-hour masterclass with opportunities to go even deeper in these. Option 2 is an interactive workshop, a more immersive interactive workshop, a half-day workshop with a maximum of 6 people where we can brainstorm and workshop. So when I say half-day, I'm talking about around about 4 hours with the opportunity to potentially workshop some particular issues that some of you may be going through. And then the opportunity, if your case is pretty serious and challenging, where you'd like a one-on-one consultation, happy to work with you to give you, whether that be an hour of your time. Ben, who's on the call, as I say, I'm in a mentor program with Ben. He's part of my mass participation masterclass. We've done 2-hour calls over the last couple of weeks with me helping him with some of his decisions around how he would move forward with his open air cinemas in Singapore. So I always like to leave people with a challenge before I finish. And my challenge to you is to make sure that you go back and you have a contingency cancellation plan in place for every single one of your events. So right now you might be wrestling on one for a particular event, but this should become core to all of your planning. And I challenge you to go back, if you might, one of the luxuries that this may bring us, and it's a horrible luxury, but in this downtime, there's opportunities for you to maybe go back and review your plans for all of your events. I would really encourage you to be able to go back and do that now. We've got probably about maybe close to 8 to 10 minutes. I think I make it probably 6 or 7 minutes to take some questions if you'd like. I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes past the deadline, but very, very open to taking some questions. Just jump in, say who your name is, and just flag up any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Because you want to incorporate the booze into the sponsorship agreement. So,
well, I said to him when I went out with like a 20K sponsorship, not realizing how many.
I can hear some chat in the background. I'm not sure if it's a particular question. Is that someone asking a question?
Chris?
Yeah.
It's Kun here from Pouch Nation. We do ticketing and technology. Hi, Chris. I just we obviously I'm in Thailand, and we are having some events cancelled. And what's your experience with insurance? We see some of our events where people took out insurance in the past, where the participants took insurance, often with third-party insurance providers. What's your experience with that? Does it work? Do they pay out in instances like a coronavirus, or at what point are people protected against cancellation?
Look, it varies very much from situation to situation. My sense is that many people in this particular industry, particularly the mass participation industry, the bulk of them probably don't have insurance, and that's kind of often a cost consideration, but certainly something that is the experience. And I'm just trying to scan through here to see. You've got Kevin on the call. Kevin, you're from Chubb, aren't you?
That's correct. It's Rob. I was just going to unmute myself and answer that question as well. So
I'd love you to jump in and give some advice there and share your insights, please.
Okay. We're an insurance company. We provide event cancellation insurance. We're getting a lot of inquiries at the moment, and there's also a lot of events that are being cancelled. Rob is right in that quite a lot of events go self-insured. They don't buy insurance. So really the key is that risk management process at the beginning. You do the assessments and then you decide, do I want to try and transfer some of this risk to an insurance company? If you were to come to us now or to any insurer, you wouldn't be able to buy insurance right now for the coronavirus. It's a known event. We only insure sort of unknown events. So if there's a last minute request to buy insurance for adverse weather because there's a typhoon approaching you, then you wouldn't be able to get insurance for that type of thing. But if you buy the insurance enough in advance when you're doing your early planning, you can get insurance for things like communicable disease. So we actually have a number of events that are being cancelled at the moment or being considered to be cancelled that actually have the cover in place for coronavirus. We have a very large event that was actually scheduled to be going on this week in Wuhan. Obviously, it has to be cancelled, and we're working through what savings they can make, and then ultimately what money they can't recover from these deposits, then that's what we're going to be paying out in the claim.
Thanks for that.
What would be the prerequisite for a vote? Would it have to be an official government announcement that the event is cancelled, or if the promoter, the organizer themselves make that decision, would the insurance still pay out? I guess it's a very fine line, right?
It depends on the type of coverage. So something like a communicable disease, you can't make the decision yourself. So it would have to be the government would make that decision that they don't want you to have this event going ahead because of the implications of having the crowds all in one place and the risk of the spread of the virus. So if it's weather related, then really you have to prove that it became a safety issue. So if there's a lightning storm, then it'd be quite easy to do. If there's strong winds, it'll be quite easy to do. So the burden of proof will be on yourself that you made that decision. You engage with the stakeholders. We had a situation like that very recently in Australia. They had all the bushfires. There was a particular music festival that was happening on a weekend, and the bushfire wasn't in the very close area, but that particular weekend they were going to have predicted temperatures of 40 degrees, very dry. There was only one road access in, and the decision made was there's a severe threat of bushfire, so therefore we're going to cancel this event, and that was something that we've paid on.
Thanks, Tony. Very insightful.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. And yeah, I think the reality is it's, one of the things you need to be very clear on is, what are your policy wordings? What are you covered for? And I think, probably one of the things you're leading to there is, as a provider, Kuhn, you're now sitting in a situation saying, well, how exposed am I if a particular event that I'm a provider for does end up being cancelled? What's the risk of me not being paid because someone goes out of business? Certainly one of the operational risks that we have in this industry. Yeah, hopefully that answered your question. If anyone's got any questions that they'd like to type in the chat box or just obviously unmute yourself and have a conversation, absolutely happy to do that. I'm happy to stay on. It's now exactly 9:30, but happy to stay on for another 10 minutes. Obviously, if those of you that need to jump on, certainly appreciate it. We've got a couple of people that have got a microphone unmuted. If you wouldn't mind muting yourself if you're not wanting to ask a question. And then just quickly on those deeper dives, if you're interested, drop a note in the chat box. If you've got to leave the call, I will send out an email. I've got another one of these calls, one of these webinars this evening. So, what's been amazing is we've had, I think, over 50 people that have registered for these. I'll send out some information, but obviously contact directly if you're interested. But anyone who's got any other questions, pop them in the chat box or just unmute yourself and ask a question. We'll be happy to try and answer it over the next 10 minutes.
Yeah, I think so too. Because to make it worth it, and we don't want to put all the others offside just for 1 year.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay. Folks, thanks a lot for signing in. Hopefully you found it useful. As always with these things, I really value feedback. If there's something that you would have hoped that I would have covered that wasn't covered, that I can possibly incorporate for the group this afternoon, or if there's any questions you have, here are my details. My email, chris@chrisrob.asia. Pop me a message, and happy to try and help out where I can. I also run from time to time, I know Dave Budge is on the call, I've run a number of webinars that he's been on to try and help share this other bits of information around our industry. I'll be running more of those over the foreseeable future. So thank you again for joining, and appreciate you giving up your time. Hope it's useful. Obviously wish everybody all the very best. Hope you don't have to cancel. Hope that this passes soon. But again, I say everything in life happens for a reason. There's a great opportunity here if you choose to take a step back and see the opportunities that this presents for you to take a look at your business and see how you might do things better. Even if you dodge a bullet this time, there may be some stuff that you might be able to learn from from this coronavirus that's going to benefit you as you take your business forward. So thank you so much. Appreciate your time. I have another one this afternoon at 4:30 Singapore time. As I say, we've got lots of people registered for that. If you have any friends who you think might benefit that you'd like to address them to, please send them the link. There's opportunity for them to still sign up for that. Have a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are. And thanks so much for your time and attendance.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everyone.